What did it actually feel like to be cold in Galilee 2,000 years ago? Not the romanticized, sun-drenched Galilee of illustrated Bibles and Hollywood films, but the real one. The one with mud on the floor, smoke hanging in low rafters, and a wind off the Golan that cut through whatever you were wearing like it had somewhere better to be. We tend to imagine the ancient Near East as perpetually warm. Desert region, broadly speaking, and so the mind fills in the blanks: dry air, bright light, dusty roads. But Galilee in winter was something else entirely. Sitting at elevations that ranged from the shores of the Sea of Galilee, itself more than 200 meters below sea level, up into the highlands near Nazareth and beyond, the region experienced a genuinely cold, wet season. December through February brought temperatures that dropped close to freezing at night, sometimes below it. Rain came hard and sideways. The limestone hills turned slick. The valleys pooled with standing water that had nowhere to go. The cold did not care about theology. If you had been born into a peasant household in first-century Galilee, and the overwhelming majority of people there were exactly that, your relationship with winter was not philosophical. It was immediate, pressing, and without negotiation. Stay with this. What we're about to uncover reshapes not just how we understand daily life in the ancient world, but how we understand the people who shaped it. The men and women who walked these hills, who prayed in these villages, who told stories around low fires, they were not abstractions. They were physical beings who got cold, who worried about grain stores, who felt the walls of their houses and understood precisely what those walls were made of and why it mattered. By the end of this, that world will feel startlingly close. The typical dwelling in a Galilean village during the 1st century was not large. Archaeological excavations at Capernaum, Magdala, and Yodfat, along with village remains throughout the lower Galilee, reveal a consistent pattern: thick basalt or limestone walls, built with minimal mud mortar, packed to hold whatever warmth the stones could absorb during daylight. Floors were beaten earth, sometimes plastered, often bare. Rooms were small and low. The ceiling was typically formed from wooden beams laid across the tops of the walls, covered with branches, reeds, and a thick layer of packed mud. That roof was not incidental. It was the primary insulating barrier between your family and the winter sky. It absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. It also, when the rains came hard, required constant maintenance. A neglected roof leaked. And a leaking roof in a one-room dwelling, where a family of 5 or 6 slept pressed together for warmth, was not a minor inconvenience. It was a crisis that arrived while you were already exhausted. The animals helped. This sounds almost quaint until you understand the physics of it. Many Galilean homes, as attested both archaeologically and in literary sources from the period, incorporated a lower section of the dwelling where the family's animals were kept at night. A donkey. A few goats. Perhaps a small number of sheep. These were not pets. They were working capital, the difference between subsistence and destitution. But in winter, they were also heat sources. A single goat produces a meaningful amount of body warmth. Several animals sharing a low-ceilinged space with a family created a microclimate that could raise the ambient temperature by several degrees. The smell was constant and considerable. The sounds, shifting hooves, the occasional low complaint of a goat, the slow rhythmic breathing of a donkey settling into sleep, formed part of the nightly soundscape of childhood for nearly every Galilean peasant born in this period. Not romantic. Not symbolic. Just practical and warm. Then there was the morning you woke and found ice on the surface of the water jar. Not thick ice. A thin skin, translucent, the kind that breaks when you press a finger against it. But it was there. And it meant the fire had gone out fully in the night, and the animal's warmth had not been enough, and the water you needed to begin the day, to wash hands before prayer, to start the bread, to give the goats something to drink, was colder than your hands. You broke the ice with your knuckle. The sound was small and sharp in the silence of early morning. The cold came up through the earth floor into the soles of your feet while you stood there. That detail appears nowhere in the historical record as a discrete event. But the conditions that produced it are thoroughly documented. It happened. Regularly. To ordinary people who then went on with their day. Cooking fire was the other primary heat source. Most homes had a simple hearth, sometimes a shallow depression in the earthen floor lined with stones, or a low clay installation set against one wall. Fuel was gathered and carefully managed. Dry dung, olive wood, brushwood from the hillsides. The smoke rose and had to go somewhere. In better constructed homes there might be a rudimentary smoke hole in the roof. In others it simply accumulated under the low ceiling and found its way out through whatever gaps the construction had left. Eyes adjusted over years. Lungs adapted. Children grew up with wood smoke as a baseline sensory condition of winter life. Bread was baked daily or close to it. Flat bread, baked on a clay tawa or against the interior wall of a small tabun oven, required grain that had to have been stored carefully from the harvest. And here the anxiety of winter intersected with something harder than weather. The Roman taxation system, layered over Herodian obligations and the temple tithe, extracted a significant portion of what a peasant family produced each year. Scholarly estimates place total tax burdens on Galilean households somewhere between 30 and 40% of annual production. On a subsistence margin, that number was not an abstraction. It was the calculation that determined whether the grain store lasted until spring. Not every family in Galilee experienced winter the same way. This seems obvious when stated plainly, but the visual sameness of village architecture can flatten what were real and sometimes sharp distinctions in lived experience. The thick-walled basalt houses of Capernaum looked superficially similar from the outside, same dark stone, same low profile, same packed mud rooflines. But inside, the differences accumulated quietly and decisively. A household with a second room had somewhere to move. A family that owned 2 donkeys instead of one had more warmth, more flexibility, more options when something went wrong. A woman whose husband had not fallen into debt to a local creditor, debt being epidemic in first-century Galilee, as the gospel parables reflect with almost casual frequency, still controlled her grain store. She still decided how thick to make the bread. Small authority. Enormous consequence. The family with olive oil to burn in a small clay lamp had light after dark. The family without it sat in the dark earlier, went to sleep earlier, simply endured the long winter nights as a physical fact with no mitigation. Lamps from this period, recovered by the hundreds from excavations across the Galilee, are small and humble objects. Wheel-thrown clay, a shallow bowl pinched at one end to hold a wick of twisted flax, filled with a few milliliters of olive oil. The light they produced was modest, enough to see within arm's reach, enough to keep darkness from being total. In a cold room, with the fire banked low when the animals settled, that small flame was not nothing. But oil had a cost. The poor burned less of it. Some nights, none at all. The darkness in those rooms was not poetic. It was just dark, and cold, and long. Water was another pressure point that winter sharpened. The seasonal rains replenished the plastered cisterns cut into bedrock beneath or beside each household. Every family with means collected rainwater from the roof through the wet months. But accessing that water in cold weather, drawing it up, carrying it, heating it over a fire that consumed precious fuel, each step carried a cost that compounded across a season. Bathing was infrequent in winter. Not from indifference, but from the arithmetic of cold and limited resources. The body carried the season on it. Clothing was layered and worn continuously for days. The basic woolen tunic of a Galilean peasant was not washed often in winter. A heavier outer cloak served multiple functions simultaneously, outerwear during the day, blanket at night, and in extremity, collateral for a debt. The legal provision preserved an older Hebrew tradition, that a creditor could not keep a poor man's cloak overnight because he needed it to sleep, was not a metaphor about dignity. It was a practical regulation written in direct response to a real and recurring situation. Someone had lost their cloak to a creditor in winter. Probably many people had. The law existed because the cold was that specific and the poverty was that ordinary. There is something that resists being reduced to hardship alone. The agricultural calendar had slowed. The fields were not calling. And the family was, by the sheer physics of cold and darkness, pressed together, into the same low room, around the same fire, breathing the same smoky air. Villages contracted inward. The social texture of daily life thickened in ways that the long exhausting days of planting and harvest never permitted. Storytelling happened. The instruction of children happened. The recitation of scripture and tradition, not as scheduled religious obligation but as the natural activity of people who were together, indoors, with time on their hands for the first time in months. The synagogue in the first century was not always a purpose-built structure. In many Galilean villages it was simply a gathering, wherever the community could assemble. The word itself means assembly. In winter, assembly was almost inevitable. Cold pressed people toward each other in ways that warmer seasons did not. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a structural one. The communities that formed around shared survival, shared grain stores negotiated quietly between neighbors, shared labor for roof repair before the rains arrived, shared animal warmth that radiated through adjacent walls, were not abstract fellowships built on noble ideals. They were material interdependencies. To be excluded from community in first-century Galilee was not a social misfortune. It was a survival calculation with a bad outcome. The isolation of the sick, the widow without male relatives to advocate for her, the family that had lost its land to an accumulating debt, these were not merely sorrowful conditions. In winter, they were dangerous ones. The cold made that danger impossible to ignore or postpone. When we read texts that emerged from this world, texts insistently concerned with feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, restoring the marginalized to community, we are not reading idealism dressed in ancient language. We are reading a precise and unsentimental diagnosis of what actually happened to people when the social fabric failed them in a season that did not negotiate. The cold was real. The hunger was real. The lamp going dark was real. The grain store running short in February was real. The reform being called for was exactly proportionate to the reality being described. Not more. Not less. 2,000 years of distance can make that world feel safely remote, available for interpretation rather than recognition. But stand for a moment in that low room. Feel the weight of the stone walls holding whatever small warmth the fire has managed to make. Listen to the animals settle into sleep. Watch the lamp. Notice how much of the room it cannot reach. This was not backdrop. This was the substance. The stories, the arguments, the silences, the parables about lamps and grain and cloaks, they came from here. From this specific cold. From these particular walls. If this kind of historical grounding matters to you, if seeing the material world behind the texts changes how you read them, then stay with this work. Like this video, subscribe to continue the journey, and leave a comment below. What details surprised you most? What shifted? Your engagement makes it possible to keep going deeper into the world that faith was actually born into.